She had 72 hours to leave. The stranger who came to evict her said, "Come with me." Instead, the cabin stood at the edge of the Montana wilderness, where the mountains met the sky in jagged defiance. Winter 1876, and the snow had come early, blanketing the world in silence, so complete it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. Inside the small timber structure, a fire burned low, casting shadows that danced across walls made from logs Sarah Brennan had helped her husband cut 3 years prior, back when his hands were still warm and his laughter still filled the spaces between the rafters. Now, those spaces held only ghosts and the particular emptiness that comes when a woman is left alone in country that forgives nothing. Sarah was 28 years old, which made her ancient by frontier standards for a woman without a husband. Her blonde hair, once bright as wheat in summer sun, had dulled to the color of winter grass, pulled back in a severe knot that spoke more of practicality than vanity. Her face still carried traces of the beauty that had made Thomas Brennan ride 40 miles just to ask her father for permission to court her. But grief had etched lines around her mouth and eyes that made her look older than her years. She was thin, too thin. The kind of thinness that comes not from illness, but from the slow erosion of caring, whether you eat or not. Thomas had been dead 8 months. Pneumonia, the doctor said, though Sarah suspected it was the mine that killed him long before the fever finished the job. He had coughed black dust for 2 years, his lungs slowly filling with the mountain he tried to hollow out for gold that never came. When he finally died, it was almost a relief, watching him drown on dry land, gasping for air that would not satisfy. She had buried him on the hill behind the cabin. Under a pine tree he used to sit beneath on summer evenings, and she had not cried. Not at the funeral. Not when the miners came to pay respects with their hats in their hands and their eyes on the ground. Not when the silence of the cabin became so loud she thought it might drive her mad. She had not cried because crying meant accepting that he was gone, and accepting meant moving forward, and moving forward felt like betrayal. So instead, she stayed frozen, suspended in the moment before loss, living in a house that was part museum and part mausoleum. Thomas's coat still hung by the door. His boots sat where he had left them. His coffee cup remained on the shelf, unwashed, the residue of his last morning still coating the bottom like sediment at the bottom of a creek bed. The mining company had given her 30 days to vacate company housing. That was 7 months ago. They had sent letters, increasingly threatening, but Sarah had burned them in the fire without reading past the first line. She had nowhere to go and no means to get there. Her family was dead, claimed by the same cholera that had swept through Missouri when she was 16. Thomas had been her family, and now he was gone, and the idea of starting over, of rebuilding, of daring to want anything beyond mere survival, felt impossible. So she stayed. She kept the fire burning. She ate when hunger became pain. She hauled water from the creek when the barrels ran dry. She existed in the space between living and dying. Not quite one, not quite the other. Waiting for something she could not name. It was on a Tuesday morning, the sky the color of old iron, when the sound of hooves broke through the silence. Sarah stood at the window, her hand going instinctively to the rifle Thomas had taught her to shoot, and watched as 2 riders crested the hill. The first was a thin man in a suit, too fine for this country. His face pinched with cold and irritation. The second made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. He sat tall in the saddle, his body radiating a kind of casual power that came from absolute confidence in his own capabilities. He was perhaps 35, though the weathering of sun and wind made age difficult to gauge. What made Sarah's pulse quicken was not his face, though it was handsome in a rough-carved way, all sharp angles and sun-darkened skin beneath a black hat worn low. It was his build. Even through his heavy coat, she could see the breadth of his shoulders, the thickness of his arms, the way he moved with the unconscious grace of someone who had mastered his own strength. When he dismounted, muscles shifting beneath fabric, Sarah found herself turning away from the window, her cheeks flushing with something that felt dangerously close to shame. She had no right to notice such things, no right to feel the stirring of something she thought had died with Thomas. The guilt crashed over her like a wave, and she gripped the rifle tighter, anchoring herself with its cold reality. The knock came sharp and authoritative. Sarah opened the door a crack, keeping the rifle visible. The man in the suit spoke first, his voice nasal and impatient. "Mrs. Brennan, I'm Gerald Hastings from the Copper Ridge Mining Company. This is our final notice. You have 72 hours to vacate this property, or we'll remove you by force." Sarah's jaw tightened. "This is my home." "This is company property," Hastings corrected. "Your husband's death nullified the housing agreement. We've been more than patient, but patience has limits. Mr. Cole here has been hired to ensure compliance." Sarah's eyes shifted to the second man. He had removed his hat, revealing dark hair shot through with gray at the temples. His eyes, she noticed with a jolt, were an unusual shade of amber, almost gold in the pale morning light. He looked at her, not with the cold assessment of a man hired to evict a widow, but with something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and rough, the kind of voice that came from years of not using it much. "Name's Jacob Cole. I'm not here to hurt you. Just here to make sure this gets resolved without trouble." "Without trouble," Sarah repeated, her voice flat. "You mean without me?" Jacob's expression flickered, something that might have been regret crossing his features. "I mean, without violence. Mr. Hastings is right that you can't stay here. Company's got new miners coming next week, and they need the housing. But maybe there's another way, somewhere you can go." "I have nowhere," Sarah said, and the truth of it rang in her voice like a bell. "No family, no money. This cabin is all I have left of my husband. If you take it, you take everything." Hastings shifted impatiently. "That's not our concern. Mr. Cole, we're leaving. The eviction stands. If she's still here in 3 days, remove her." He turned and mounted his horse without another word, leaving Jacob standing on the porch, his hat in his hands, his eyes still on Sarah's face. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for your loss, and for this." Then he too mounted and rode away, leaving Sarah standing in the doorway, the rifle heavy in her hands, the weight of inevitability heavier on her chest. That night, Sarah sat by the fire and allowed herself to think about the impossible. She could leave, pack what little she owned, walk into town, and throw herself on the mercy of people who had none to give. She could try to find work, though work for women without husbands was scarce and often degrading. She could write to distant cousins she barely remembered, begging for charity she had no right to ask for. Or she could stay and force them to drag her out, clinging to Thomas's memory until the last possible moment, choosing dignity over survival. She was still weighing these options when the knock came again, softer this time, almost hesitant. Sarah opened the door to find Jacob Cole standing alone in the darkness, snow beginning to fall around him in thick, lazy flakes. "Mr. Cole," Sarah said, suspicion sharp in her voice. "Come to start the eviction early?" "No, ma'am," Jacob said. "Came to offer you an alternative." Sarah waited, her hand tight on the doorframe. Jacob took a breath, his words coming slow, as though he was still deciding whether to speak them. "I have a ranch, 40 miles south. It's not much, but it's mine, and it's big enough for two. I'm offering you a place, not charity. Partnership. You work the ranch with me, you earn your keep. You have a roof that's yours." Sarah stared at him. "Why would you do that?" Jacob's eyes met hers, and in them she saw something she recognized. Loss. The kind of loss that carved holes in a person and never quite filled back in. "Because 8 years ago I lost my wife and daughter to fever. Been alone since. Ranch is too much for one person, and I'm tired of being alone. And because dragging a widow from her home doesn't sit right with me. This way, everybody gets something they need." "You don't know me," Sarah said. "No," Jacob agreed. "But I know grief, and I know what it looks like when someone's given up. I've been there. Maybe we can help each other remember how not to be there." Sarah felt something crack inside her chest, a fissure in the ice she had built around herself. "I was never meant to love again," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Thomas was it for me. I can't. I won't." "I'm not asking you to love me," Jacob said quietly. "I'm asking you to survive. The rest, if it comes, comes. If it doesn't, that's fine too. But you deserve to live, Mrs. Brennan. Even if right now you don't believe that." Sarah looked past him at the falling snow, at the darkness beyond, at the choice he was offering. Stay and cling to the past until it dragged her under, or step forward into something uncertain but possible. "I need time to think," she said finally. Jacob nodded. "You have 3 days. If you decide yes, I'll be here at dawn on the 4th day. If not, I'll understand." He turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Brennan, I think Thomas would want you to live. Men who love their wives don't want them to die with them." Then he was gone, swallowed by the snow and the night, leaving Sarah alone with a choice that felt both impossible and inevitable. The next 2 days passed in a haze of indecision. Sarah moved through the cabin, touching everything Thomas had touched, trying to memorize the shape of their life together. She sat by his grave and spoke to the frozen earth, asking for permission she knew would never come, not because Thomas wouldn't give it, but because the dead don't speak. She read and reread the letters he had written her during their brief courtship, his handwriting bold and confident, full of plans for a future that never arrived. On the 3rd night, Sarah built the fire high and sat before it, Thomas's coat in her lap. She buried her face in the fabric and inhaled, searching for any trace of him, but found only the smell of old wool and wood smoke. He was gone. Not just his body, but his presence, his essence, everything that had made him Thomas, and not just a collection of belongings left behind. And Sarah realized, sitting there in the firelight, that she was gone too. The woman who had married Thomas, who had laughed and dreamed and believed in forever. That woman had died on the same day he had. What remained was a ghost haunting a museum, and ghosts didn't live. They just lingered. Maybe Jacob Cole was right. Maybe survival was enough for now. Maybe choosing to breathe, to eat, to work, to exist in the present instead of the past. Maybe that wasn't betrayal. Maybe that was honoring Thomas by not wasting the life he would have wanted her to have. When dawn broke on the fourth day, Sarah was packed. Not everything. She left Thomas's coat on the hook, his boots by the door, his coffee cup on the shelf. She left the museum intact, a shrine to what was, and she took only what she would need for what might be. A change of clothes, her mother's Bible. The wedding ring she wore on a chain around her neck, because her finger had grown too thin to hold it. Jacob arrived as promised, riding through the pale morning light with a second horse in tow. He didn't ask if she was certain, didn't make speeches or offer reassurances. He simply helped her tie her small bag to the saddle, mounted his own horse, and waited. Sarah took one last look at the cabin. Then she mounted, and together they rode south, leaving the past on that hillside under the pine tree, riding toward something unknown. The ranch was indeed not much. A small house, weathered but solid, built into the side of a hill, with the mountains rising behind it, like guardians. A barn that leaned slightly to the left, corrals holding a dozen horses and a few head of cattle. A creek running cold and clear through the property. It was isolated, miles from the nearest town, the kind of place where a person could disappear if they wanted to. Jacob showed her to a small room at the back of the house. "This was my daughter's," he said, his voice catching slightly on the word. "It's yours now. I sleep in the front room. Door has a lock if you want it." Sarah nodded, grateful for the space, the boundaries, the clarity of expectations. The first weeks were awkward, two strangers navigating shared space with elaborate politeness. They worked from dawn to dusk, Jacob showing Sarah the rhythms of ranch life. She learned to mend fences, to feed livestock, to recognize when a horse was favoring a leg or a cow was about to calve. The work was hard, harder than anything she had done as a miner's wife, but it was also consuming, leaving no room for the thoughts that had haunted her in the cabin. Jacob was a man of few words, but his silence was different from hers. Hers was grief. His was simply nature. He spoke when words were needed, otherwise let quiet fill the spaces between them. Sarah found it oddly comforting. There was no pressure to perform normalcy, no expectation that she pretend to be healing when she wasn't. At night, they ate together. Simple meals cooked in turns, and then retreated to separate rooms. Sometimes Sarah heard Jacob moving in the night, his footsteps pacing, and she recognized insomnia born of ghosts. She never mentioned it, just as he never mentioned the nights when her crying filtered through the thin walls. 3 months passed. Winter deepened, and the work became about survival. They hauled water from the creek before it froze solid. They stockpiled firewood until the pile reached the roof of the barn. They brought the cattle close and fed them hay Jacob had stored through the summer. The isolation that had felt heavy at first began to feel like protection. The snow a wall keeping the world at bay. It was during a blizzard, the wind howling like something alive, that the first crack appeared in the careful distance they maintained. Sarah had gone to check on the horses, despite Jacob's warning that the storm was too dangerous. She made it to the barn, but on the return trip, the wind knocked her off her feet. She lay in the snow, disoriented, unable to tell which direction was the house, the cold seeping through her clothes with terrifying speed. Then hands were pulling her up, strong arms wrapping around her, and Jacob was half carrying, half dragging her through the storm. He got her inside, stripped off her wet clothes with clinical efficiency, while she shook too hard to help, and wrapped her in blankets by the fire. He made her drink hot coffee, laced with whiskey, and only when her shaking subsided and color returned to her face did he speak. "Don't do that again," he said, his voice rough with something that sounded like fear. "I can't lose." He stopped, jaw tightening. "Just don't." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, and saw past the careful control to the terror underneath. He had been afraid, not of the work of saving her, but of failing to save her, of losing someone again. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I wasn't thinking." "You were thinking," Jacob said quietly. "But not about staying alive. That needs to change, Sarah." It was the first time he had used her given name, and hearing it in his voice did something to her, shifted something fundamental. She was not just Mrs. Brennan, the widow to be handled with careful politeness. She was Sarah, and he saw her. "I don't know how," she admitted, the truth spilling out. "I don't know how to care about staying alive when the person I was supposed to stay alive for is gone." Jacob moved to sit beside her, close but not touching. "You start small. You care about not freezing, about eating, about getting through one day, then another, and eventually, the days add up to something that looks like life." "Does it get easier?" Sarah asked. "No," Jacob said honestly. "But it gets different, less sharp, more like an old wound that aches in cold weather, instead of a fresh cut that bleeds every time you move." They sat together in silence, the fire crackling, the storm raging outside, and Sarah felt something she had not felt in months. Not happiness, not even hope, but the absence of complete despair. A small opening where light might eventually enter. Spring came slowly, the snow melting in reluctant increments, revealing brown grass that gradually greened. The ranch came alive with new calves and foals, with birds returning from wherever they fled winter, with the creek running high and wild. Sarah found herself waking earlier, not because she had to, but because she wanted to see the sunrise, paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. She began to notice things, the way Jacob's hands moved with unconscious grace when he worked leather, the rare smile that softened his face when a foal took its first wobbly steps, the patience with which he taught her things, never making her feel foolish for not knowing, the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching, his eyes holding something warm and careful, and she noticed the way her own body responded, the catch in her breath when he stood close, the awareness of his physical presence, the breadth of his shoulders, the strength in his arms, the guilt that followed each noticed detail, sharp and immediate, a voice in her head that sounded like betrayal. It came to a head on an evening in late spring. They were repairing the barn roof, working side by side in companionable silence, when Jacob reached past her for a hammer and his bare arm brushed against hers. It was nothing, the barest contact, but Sarah jerked away as if burned. Jacob pulled back immediately. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "It's not you," Sarah said quickly. "It's me, I can't—" She climbed down from the roof, her hands shaking, and walked toward the creek, needing distance. Jacob followed, his footsteps quiet behind her. "Sarah." She turned, tears streaming down her face. "I feel things for you. Things I shouldn't feel. Things I swore I'd never feel for anyone but Thomas. And it makes me a liar and a traitor. And I don't know how to stop it. And I don't know if I want to stop it. And that makes it worse." The words hung between them, raw and honest. Jacob stood very still, his face unreadable in the fading light. "You're not a traitor," he said finally. "You're alive, that's all. Just alive." "Thomas was my husband," Sarah said, the words breaking. "I loved him. I still love him. How can I feel anything for someone else when he's barely cold in the ground?" "It's been a year," Jacob said gently. "And Sarah, loving someone new doesn't erase loving someone who's gone. Hearts don't work that way. They don't have limits. They don't fill up and refuse more. I told myself I was never meant to love again," Sarah whispered. "That Thomas was my one chance, and losing him meant that was it. No more. Never again." Jacob stepped closer, his hand rising as if to touch her face, then dropping. "Maybe you weren't meant to. Or maybe you were meant to love a lot of people in your life, and Thomas was one, and there might be others. Maybe meant is just a story we tell ourselves to make sense of things that don't have sense." Sarah looked up at him, this man who had offered her survival when she wanted to die, who had given her space to grieve and work to fill her hands, who had asked nothing but given everything. "What do you want from me, Jacob?" "I want you to let yourself live," Jacob said. "Really live. Not just survive. Not just go through motions. I want you to believe you deserve more than grief and guilt, and if someday that means you feel something for me, I'll count myself blessed. But if it doesn't, if all you ever feel is friendship and partnership, that's enough. You're enough. Just as you are." Sarah felt something break open inside her, a dam giving way, and the tears came in earnest. Jacob pulled her into his arms, and she let him, let herself be held, let herself take comfort from another human being for the first time since Thomas died. She cried into his chest while he held her steady, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring wordless comfort. When the storm passed, Sarah pulled back enough to look up at him. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "Of what?" "Of forgetting him. Of moving on and leaving him behind. Of dishonoring what we had." "You won't forget," Jacob said with certainty. "Love that real doesn't fade just because you find more. It lives alongside whatever comes next. And Thomas wouldn't want you stuck in the past. Men who love their wives want them to live fully, even after they're gone." Sarah realized he was right. Thomas had been generous in life, generous with his love and laughter and dreams. He would not have wanted her to shrink into grief and stay there. He would have wanted her to find joy again, to build a life, to be happy. Believing otherwise was making him smaller than he was. "I don't know how to do this," Sarah said. "How to let myself feel things. How to move forward." Same way you learned everything else here, Jacob said with a small smile. One day at a time, one small choice after another. That night, Sarah did not retreat to her room immediately after supper. She sat by the fire with Jacob, and they talked. Really talked, not just about work or weather, but about lives lived before this moment. Jacob told her about his wife, Claire, and their daughter, Emma, about the fever that took them both within days of each other, about the years of numbness that followed, the ranch becoming both refuge and prison. Sarah told him about Thomas, about the boy who had ridden 40 miles to court her, about their wedding in a small church with wildflowers in her hair, about the plans they had made for children and a farm, and growing old together. They talked until the fire burned low, and when they finally stood to go to their separate rooms, Jacob took her hand and squeezed it gently. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me know him through you." Sarah squeezed back. "Thank you for understanding that knowing him matters." Summer came, and with it a lightness Sarah had not felt in over a year. She laughed at something one of the horses did, a genuine laugh that surprised her with its ease. She sang while working in the garden she had planted, old songs her mother taught her. She began to look forward to meals with Jacob, to the conversations that ranged from practical to philosophical, to the comfortable silences that no longer felt heavy. And slowly, carefully, with the tentative steps of someone learning to walk after a long illness, Sarah let herself feel. She noticed the way Jacob's eyes crinkled when he smiled, the sound of his laugh, rare and deep, the competence of his hands, the gentleness with which he treated injured animals, the way he looked at her like she was something precious, something worth protecting, not because she was fragile, but because she was valuable. She also noticed her own responses, the way her pulse quickened when he entered a room, the pleasure she took in making him smile. The night she caught herself wondering what it would feel like to kiss him, and did not immediately drown the thought in guilt. It was Jacob who made the first move, and he did it in a way that gave Sarah every opportunity to refuse. They were standing on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, and Jacob turned to her. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I'm going to tell you something, and you don't have to respond. You don't have to feel the same way. But I need to say it, because keeping it inside is becoming harder than saying it." Sarah's heart hammered, but she nodded. "I love you," Jacob said simply. "Not the way I loved Claire. Different, but just as real. You've brought light back into my life. You've reminded me that what it means to want tomorrow. And if all we ever are is partners and friends, I can live with that. But I wanted you to know that you're loved, that you're worth loving, and that whatever you feel or don't feel, that's okay." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but they were not tears of grief. They were something else, something that felt like release. "Jacob, She paused, searching for the right words. "I spent so long believing I couldn't love again, that I wasn't meant to, that doing so would somehow betray Thomas or diminish what we had. But you've shown me that's not true, that hearts don't run out of room. And She took a breath. "I love you too. It terrifies me, but I do." Jacob's face transformed, joy breaking across it like sunrise. "You're sure?" "No," Sarah said honestly. "I'm not sure of anything except that I want to try. I want to see where this goes. I want to choose life and you and tomorrow." Jacob reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. "Can I kiss you?" Sarah nodded, and when his lips met hers, gentle and questioning, she felt not guilt, but rightness. This was not betrayal. This was survival in its truest form. This was choosing to live. The seasons turned. Summer became autumn, became winter again. Sarah and Jacob married in the spring, a small ceremony with a traveling preacher, and 2 ranchers from a neighboring spread as witnesses. Sarah wore a simple blue dress, not white, because this was not a first love but a second chance, and she honored the difference. She wore Thomas's ring on a chain around her neck, and Jacob wore a ring that had belonged to his father. They exchanged vows under the same sky that had witnessed so much loss, and promised each other not forever, because they both knew forever was a lie, the young told themselves, but today, and tomorrow, and as many days as they were given. Their marriage was not without complications. There were nights when Sarah woke crying from dreams of Thomas, and Jacob held her without jealousy, understanding that grief did not follow timelines. There were days when Jacob grew distant, lost in memories of Claire and Emma, and Sarah gave him space without taking it personally. They learned to love each other while honoring the loves that came before, making room for all of it, refusing to pretend the past didn't exist in order to build a future. A year into their marriage, Sarah realized she was pregnant. The news brought joy, mixed with terror. She had wanted children with Thomas, had mourned that loss along with losing him. Having a child with Jacob felt like both gift and betrayal, another way in which life moved forward, whether she was ready or not. Jacob, seeing her struggle, took her face in his hands. This child doesn't replace anything, doesn't erase anyone. This child is new, just new, and you're allowed to be happy about it. The permission was what Sarah needed. She let herself be happy. She let herself plan and dream and hope. And when their daughter was born on a cold November morning, her cry filling the small ranch house with proof of life continuing, Sarah wept with joy that was uncomplicated by guilt for the first time since Thomas died. They named her Hope because that's what she represented. Not forgetting, but remembering while still moving forward. Not betrayal, but honoring the dead by living fully. 2 years later came a son they named Thomas, and if Jacob minded that his son carried another man's name, he never said. He understood what Sarah needed, the way she needed to weave her past into her present, to keep Thomas alive in memory and action, even as she built something new. Sarah still visited Thomas's grave when they went to town. She brought flowers and told him about her life, about Jacob and the children and the ranch. She introduced him to Hope, held up as a baby to a headstone and said, "This is your hope, Thomas. I hope you'd be happy for me." And she chose to believe he would be. On the 10th anniversary of Thomas's death, Sarah stood on the hill behind their ranch, watching the sunset. Jacob found her there, slipped his arm around her waist. "You thinking about him?" he asked. "Always," Sarah said, "but differently now. I used to think about him and feel only loss. Now I think about him and feel gratitude for what we had, for what he taught me, for the fact that loving him prepared me to love you." "He was a lucky man," Jacob said, "to be loved by you." "I was lucky too," Sarah said, "to be loved by both of you." They stood together as the sun disappeared and the stars emerged. Two people who had learned that love was not a finite resource, that hearts could break and mend and break again and still function, that moving forward was not the same as leaving behind, and that sometimes the greatest act of love was allowing yourself to love again. Sarah had believed she was never meant to love again. She had been wrong. She had been meant to learn that love was not singular, but plural, not replacement, but addition, not forgetting, but remembering while also living. Thomas would always be her first love, the boy who rode 40 miles, the man who made her laugh. But Jacob was her second chance, the man who reminded her she was more than her grief, who showed her that surviving could become living. And in the end, that was not betrayal. That was the highest form of honoring the dead, by refusing to die with them. Years later, when Sarah was old and gray, sitting on that same porch with Jacob beside her, and their grown children visiting with grandchildren in tow, someone asked her about her first husband. Sarah smiled, the sadness no longer sharp, and said, "I loved him with my whole heart, and when he died, I thought that was the end of love. But Jacob taught me that hearts don't work that way. They expand, they adapt, they love again, not less, but different. And that's not forgetting, that's honoring. Because the greatest tribute to a love that was real is refusing to let it be the last love you ever allow yourself to feel." She took Jacob's weathered hand in hers and squeezed. "I was never meant to love again," she said, "but I'm so grateful I was wrong." Leave a like, subscribe, and get notified to Western Stories and Tales for more epic tales from the untamed West.